In 1944, the pharmaceutical industry erased a painkiller that had worked for 2,500 years. Not because it was dangerous, because anyone could grow it for free, and that was worth billions to bury. The forgotten painkiller, growing along every road. Wild lettuce stands 6 feet tall, crowned with small yellow flowers. Green stems are sometimes spotted purple, jagged leaves with spines running down the central vein. When you cut the stem, white liquid bleeds out like tears from a wound. The ancients called this lactucarium. When dried, it hardens into a brown resin that looks very much like crude opium. For millennia, this plant answered suffering. Egyptian scribes recorded it in medical texts. Roman physicians carried it to battlefields. European doctors prescribed it for insomnia and pain. By 1799, it reached American stores, sitting on shelves beside morphine and laudanum. Then, something shifted. The pharmaceutical industry learned to build molecules from scratch. Synthetic compounds could be patented, marketed, and protected. Every bottle sold generated profit for decades. But wild lettuce grew free. Anyone could harvest it. No patent, no exclusive rights, no recurring revenue. By 1944, it fell from official medicine. Doctors stopped prescribing it, pharmacies stopped stocking it. A generation trained after 1950 never learned it existed. The plant still grows in those same ditches. It waits for hands willing to remember what 2,000 years already knew. This is the story of how an empire worth billions buried medicine that grew free, and why that empire is starting to crack. The lettuce of the gods. The archive opens in ancient Egypt, 1550 before Common Era. Inside the Ebers, papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever discovered, scribes recorded a plant they called lettuce of the gods. Its milky sap drove away pain and brought sleep. The papyrus itself stretches over 60 feet long, containing 700 remedies collected across generations. Among recipes for healing broken bones and treating fever, the scribes devoted careful attention to this particular lettuce. They understood what it could do. Pain existed, and this plant answered it. Centuries later, Greek physician Dioscorides documented it in 77 Common Era. He called it Lactuca virosa, the bitter lettuce. He watched it work on a screaming patient with a shattered leg. Within minutes, the screams stopped. The man slept. And unlike opium, he woke up clear-headed, asking for food. The name itself reveals its secret. Lacta comes from the Latin for milk. Virosa means potent. Ancient physicians called it lettuce opium, not because it created addiction, but because of what it could accomplish. It relieved pain, calmed coughs, and brought sleep, all without the chains that bound patients to true opium. Romans used it to treat everything from insomnia to battlefield wounds. For centuries, it was simply understood. The knowledge traveled across empires, passed from Greek to Roman to Arab physicians, carried along trade routes and into medieval Europe. By the time it reached America, it had already proven itself for over 2,000 years. When you cut the stem, it bleeds white. The plant itself stands defiant, sometimes reaching 6 feet tall, crowned with clusters of small yellow flowers. Green stems are often spotted purple. Leaves are jagged with spines running down the central vein, giving it a wild, untamed appearance. The sap holds the concentrated power. Fresh lactucarium has a bitter taste and a distinctive smell. When exposed to air, the white liquid oxidizes and darkens, eventually forming a hard, brittle resin. Ancient physicians learned to collect it on plates or directly into alcohol, preserving the active compounds before they degraded. The dried resin could be stored, transported, and dissolved when needed. What made it remarkable was what it could do. It relieved pain. It calmed relentless coughs. It brought sleep to those who couldn't rest. And critically, it did all this without creating the desperate craving that opium produced. Patients didn't wake up needing more. They didn't spiral into dependency. They simply found relief and moved on with their lives. Romans carried it to battlefields across Europe. When soldiers suffered wounds far from proper medical care, field physicians would administer lactucarium to dull the agony. For centuries, it was simply part of the arsenal against suffering. No controversy, no scandal, just medicine that worked. But free medicine has enemies, and those enemies were about to get very powerful. the medicine cabinet of early America. By 1799, the lactucarium reached the United States. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacists sold it in tinctures and lozenges. It sat on shelves beside laudanum and morphine as one more tool against suffering. American physicians had inherited centuries of European medical knowledge, and wild lettuce came with it. You could walk into any store in Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston and find it available. No prescription needed, no questions asked. It was simply medicine, as common as willow bark for fever or chamomile for digestion. The tinctures were made by dissolving the dried resin in alcohol, creating a standardized dose that physicians could prescribe with confidence. Lozenges offered a milder option for coughs and sleeplessness. Medical journals of the early 1800s referenced it casually, the way modern doctors might mention ibuprofen. It wasn't controversial, it wasn't exotic, it was just another reliable option in the physician's toolkit. When patients complained of chronic pain, insomnia, or persistent coughs, lactucarium offered relief without the risks that came with stronger opiates. For decades, it remained quietly effective, serving American families without fanfare or debate. Pharmacists didn't know they were stocking a remedy that would soon be worth less than the glass bottles it came in. Then, in 1861, everything changed. The American Civil War erupted, and within months, medical supplies faced catastrophe, when Confederate surgeons had nothing left. In 1861, the American Civil War erupted. Within months, Union Army medical supplies faced catastrophe. The Union alone issued nearly 10 million opium pills to its soldiers, but Confederate forces had almost none. The Union naval blockade strangled Southern supply lines with ruthless efficiency. Morphine, chloroform, and other essential medicines couldn't reach Confederate hospitals. By 1862, field hospitals throughout the South ran out of morphine entirely. What followed was horror beyond imagination. Surgeons amputated limbs without anesthesia. Soldiers perished screaming, their voices echoing across makeshift hospital tents. Men bit down on leather straps or wooden sticks, while doctors sawed through bone. The medical crisis wasn't limited to surgery. Thousands of wounded soldiers lay in agony with no relief. Illness, infections, and chronic pain ravaged the ranks. Confederate medical officers faced an impossible situation. They had sick and suffering men, surgical procedures that couldn't wait, and empty medicine cabinets. Desperate physicians turned to what grew free. Wild lettuce thrived across southern roadsides, riverbanks, and abandoned fields. It grew in ditches near battlefields, along fence lines, in every forgotten corner where war hadn't yet trampled the earth. The plant didn't require importation, didn't need blockade runners, and didn't depend on foreign supply chains. Confederate surgeons had read the medical texts. They knew ancient history. With nothing else available, they faced a stark choice: let men suffer and perish, or harvest what grew wild, and hope it still worked the way the old books promised. The painkiller that saved the South. Desperate Confederate surgeons harvested it themselves, cutting stems, collecting the milky sap, drying it into brown resin. It worked. The process was crude but effective. Medical officers and their assistants would venture into fields near camp, armed with knives and collection plates. They'd cut the tall stems of wild lettuce, watching the white sap bleed from the wounds. The latex would be scraped onto plates or directly into alcohol to preserve it. Under the southern sun, the sap dried into the same hard, dark resin that ancient physicians had relied upon. It wasn't as powerful as morphine. It didn't provide the complete numbing that chloroform offered, but it dulled the unbearable. It took the edge off agony that would otherwise drive men mad. It allowed surgeries to proceed when the alternative was watching men perish from infected wounds. It gave soldiers enough peace to sleep, to eat, to survive another day. Confederate medical officers documented it in field reports. When liquid opium became scarce, lactucarium provided essential relief. One surgeon wrote that wild lettuce kept more soldiers alive than any other substitute remedy they found. The North watched. Union medical officers read the Confederate reports and took note. When the war ended in 1865, American doctors had learned something critical. They had witnessed lactucarium work under battlefield conditions. But they had also seen something else. Opium addiction was destroying thousands of veterans, and this plant showed no such curse. The race was on to prove it scientifically. When the hypodermic needle created an epidemic, when the Civil War ended in 1865, American doctors had learned something critical. Opium addiction was destroying thousands of veterans. The hypodermic needle, introduced in 1856 and used widely by the 1870s, had created an epidemic. The war had transformed medical practice. The hypodermic syringe allowed morphine to be injected directly into the bloodstream, providing instant relief from unbearable pain. It seemed like a miracle at first. Wounded soldiers, who would have perished screaming instead, found immediate peace. But the miracle had a terrible cost. Veterans returned home carrying a desperate craving. They needed the needle again and again. What began as treatment became enslavement. Families watched fathers and sons transform into hollow-eyed strangers who would do anything for another dose. By 1895, 1 in every 200 Americans was addicted to opiates. Medical journals began publishing worried observations. The very tool that had saved so many lives on the battlefield was now destroying them at home. Doctors searched for alternatives, anything that could relieve chronic pain without creating the chains of dependency. Wild lettuce emerged in these discussions with renewed interest. Confederate field reports had documented its effectiveness. More importantly, those same reports showed something remarkable. Soldiers treated with lactucarium didn't develop the desperate craving. They didn't wake up needing more. They simply found relief and moved on. In the 1870s, Polish physicians decided to test this observation formally. The side-by-side study that changed everything. In the 1870s, Polish physicians began methodical studies. They had access to both opium and wild lettuce. They tested them side by side on patients suffering chronic pain, coughs, and insomnia. These weren't casual observations or anecdotal reports. Polish doctors conducted systematic comparisons, documenting results in medical journals with the same rigor applied to any pharmaceutical study. They administered measured doses to patients with similar conditions and tracked the outcomes carefully. The results, published in multiple 19th century Polish medical journals, were remarkable. One physician wrote that the action of lactucarium was weaker than that of opium, but free of the side effects. He documented a textile worker, a woman with chronic arthritis who'd been addicted to opium for 3 years. Switched to wild lettuce, her pain eased. Within 2 months, she no longer craved anything. She simply took it when her hands ached and stopped when they didn't. Another noted that in some cases lactucarium produced better curative effects than opium, not just comparable, but actually superior for certain conditions. The critical discoveries went beyond pain relief. Lactucarium showed no addiction. Patients didn't develop tolerance, didn't wake up craving more, didn't spiral into dependency. There was no respiratory depression, the dangerous side effect that ended opium users' lives in their sleep. No euphoria that enslaved patients to the needle. For physicians searching for safer alternatives to opium, this was exactly what they'd been hoping to find. The Polish studies provided scientific validation for what battlefield surgeons and ancient physicians had observed. Wild lettuce worked, and it worked without destroying lives. The day it sat beside aspirin in the pharmacy. By 1898, the United States Pharmacopeia, the official compendium of approved medicines, listed wild lettuce alongside morphine and aspirin. It was standardized, tested, and official. This wasn't a footnote or a folk remedy tucked away in the margins. Wild lettuce received the same recognition as the most trusted medicines of the era. The Pharmacopeia established dosing guidelines, quality standards, and preparation methods. Physicians could prescribe it with confidence. In 1911, the British Pharmaceutical Codex added it for use in lozenges, tinctures, and syrups as a sedative for irritable cough, or as a mild hypnotic for insomnia. The medical establishment on both sides of the Atlantic had reached the same conclusion. This medicine worked. The Sievers Company's 1917 medicinal plant catalog described it as highly esteemed to quiet coughing and allay nervous irritation, calling it a good safe remedy to produce sleep to be used when opium and other narcotics are objectionable. That description was written when opium and cocaine were still sold over the counter in American stores. Wild lettuce wasn't positioned as a desperate alternative. It was recommended as the safer first choice. Doctors prescribed it, pharmacists stocked it, patients trusted it. It appeared in medical textbooks, professional journals, and standard pharmaceutical references. Then the industry shifted beneath it. The entire philosophy of medicine discovery was about to change, and a plant that had survived 2,000 years wouldn't survive 20 more. If you want to see more stories about forgotten medicines that could have changed everything, hit subscribe. Because what happens next to wild lettuce? It gets worse before it gets better. When medicine stopped growing and started being built, the 1930s through the 1960s birthed the pharmaceutical golden age. Penicillin, sulfonamides, synthetic vitamins, antibiotics that cured tuberculosis and pneumonia for the first time in human history. But something else changed. The entire philosophy of medicine discovery. Pharmaceutical companies shifted from natural products to synthetic chemistry. New laboratories abandoned beakers of plant extracts for molecular models and X-ray crystallography. Chemists learned to build molecules from scratch, atom by atom, creating compounds that had never existed in nature. Aspirin was synthesized in 1899. Barbiturates appeared in 1901. Eventually, Tylenol arrived in 1955. The advantage was control. A synthetic molecule could be patented, marketed, priced, and protected by law. Every bottle sold generated profit for decades under exclusive rights. Companies could manufacture millions of identical doses in sterile factories, ensuring consistency that wild harvested plants could never match. Natural medicines couldn't compete in this new landscape. Wild lettuce grew free along roadsides. Anyone could harvest it. There was no patent possible, no exclusive rights to enforce, no recurring revenue model to build an empire upon. A pharmaceutical company could spend millions researching it and watch competitors immediately copy their work the moment it showed promise. The economics were simple and brutal. Synthetic compounds made fortunes. Wild plants made none. By the 1940s, new regulations would make the gap even wider, and wild lettuce would face a barrier it couldn't cross. When proving what everyone knew became impossible. By the 1940s, the Food and Administration expanded its authority. The Insulin Amendment of 1941 required all batches of insulin to be tested for purity. The Penicillin Amendment of 1945 did the same for antibiotics. Regulation tightened. Standardization became law. These changes came from good intentions. Too many patients had perished from contaminated medicines and fraudulent remedies. The new regulations protected public health, but they also created a barrier that natural medicines struggled to cross. Wild lettuce faced an impossible test. To remain in the Pharmacopeia, it needed clinical trials, multi-phase testing, and millions of dollars in research funding. But who would fund it? You cannot patent a plant that grows wild. Any company that invested millions would watch competitors immediately harvest the same free plant and undercut their prices. There was no financial incentive to prove what centuries already knew. Somewhere in America, a pharmacist who'd stocked wild lettuce for 40 years received a letter. His supplier was discontinuing lactucarium. No demand, the letter said. He sold the last bottle in 1946 to an elderly woman who'd used it for insomnia since she was a girl. She asked when he'd have more. He told her never. She cried in his shop. In 1944, researcher Fulton published what amounted to a final sentence. Modern medicine, he wrote, considered its sleep-producing qualities a superstition and its therapeutic action doubtful or nil. Never mind that it had relieved pain for 2,500 years. Why the store-bought version stopped working. Fulton's study claimed commercial lactucarium preparations were without effect. Never mind that Civil War surgeons used it when morphine ran out. Never mind that Polish doctors documented its safety. The damage was done. Later research would reveal why commercial products failed. The active compounds, lactucin and lactucopacrin, are chemically unstable. They degrade when exposed to light, heat, and time. Fresh lactucarium, harvested and used within weeks, worked exactly as the ancient texts promised. But shelf-stable commercial preparations, manufactured in factories and stored in warehouses for months, lost their potency before they ever reached patients. The pharmaceutical industry had created a cruel irony. In trying to standardize and mass-produce wild lettuce, they had destroyed what made it effective. The very compounds that relieved pain couldn't survive the modern supply chain. Fresh sap collected from living plants retained its power. Dried resin stored properly maintained effectiveness. But factory-processed tinctures sitting on the store shelves for a year became little more than bitter-tasting water. Fulton's study tested these degraded commercial products, not fresh lactucarium. The conclusion was technically accurate, but fundamentally misleading. The preparations he tested truly were ineffective. But that didn't mean the plant itself had failed. It meant modern manufacturing had failed the plant. But nobody made that distinction. In 1944, wild lettuce fell from the Pharmacopeia. Doctors stopped prescribing it. Pharmacies stopped stocking it. A generation of physicians trained after 1950 never learned it existed. And the people who remembered, they passed away in silence, taking the knowledge with them. The $80 billion industry that rose from the ashes. What rose in wild lettuce's place was an empire worth billions. The global pain relief market reached $80 billion by 2023. Over-the-counter analgesics alone generate $30 billion annually. Aspirin dominates with staggering numbers. Approximately 60 billion tablets are consumed worldwide each year. Behind those numbers are people. A construction worker in Ohio takes 8 ibuprofen daily for back pain, knowing it's destroying his stomach. A nurse in California watches her father pass away from acetaminophen liver failure. He'd been taking it for arthritis, never exceeding the label dose. In 2023 alone, prescription opioids ended 70,000 American lives. Big Pharma built fortunes on molecules it could patent. Ibuprofen, acetaminophen, naproxen, each one protected by intellectual property law, each one requiring purchase again and again. The genius was creating recurring need. Pain exists everywhere. Headaches, arthritis, back pain, surgical recovery. The pharmaceutical industry promised relief for a price. $20 for a bottle of Advil, $15 for Tylenol. But the human cost is what the numbers hide. Side effects plague every solution. Ibuprofen causes stomach ulcers and bleeding. Acetaminophen damages livers. Opioids created the addiction crisis, still ending 100,000 American lives per year. The search for alternatives drove billions in research. CBD oil, turmeric, medical marijuana. Yet wild lettuce, proven non-addictive for 2,500 years, remained forgotten. Then, in the 1970s, something unexpected happened. Drop a comment below. Have you or someone you know been affected by the opioid crisis or painkiller side effects? The pharmaceutical industry doesn't want this conversation happening. Let's have it anyway. When the forgotten plant found new believers. Then, in the 1970s, something unexpected happened. The counterculture discovered it. Young people seeking legal alternatives to controlled substances found references in old herbals. Lettuce opium. They brewed teas from dried leaves. They smoked the plant material mixed with catnip and damiana. Some prepared crude tinctures using methods described in the century-old pharmacy guides. The effects were mild, nothing like marijuana or actual opiates, but it was legal. The Food and Administration had never scheduled wild lettuce as a controlled substance. This brought attention, not from doctors, but from researchers. Scientists became curious about what these young experimenters had rediscovered. In 2005, researchers at the University of Arizona tested lactucin and lactucopacrin, the active compounds, on mice. At doses of 30 milligrams per kilogram, the compounds produced pain relief, comparable to ibuprofen. A 2021 study confirmed the mechanism. Lactucin acts as an adenosine receptor agonist, calming nerve signals without triggering opioid receptors. No addiction pathway, no respiratory depression. The compounds also inhibit acetylcholinesterase, the same target as some Alzheimer's medications. Wild lettuce doesn't just dull pain, it may protect cognitive function. Modern science had finally validated what ancient physicians knew. The plant worked, and the mechanism explained why it never created the problems that opiates did. But by then, the medical establishment had moved on. What grows free? While we pay billions, wild lettuce never left. It still grows along roadsides from California to Massachusetts, on riverbanks across Europe, in waste ground from Iran to Scotland. You can identify it if you know what to look for. A tall stem, sometimes reaching 6 feet, occasionally spotted with purple, jagged leaves with spines running along the central vein, small yellow flowers clustered at the top. Cut the stem and white sap bleeds out, the same lactucarium that ancient Egyptians harvested, that Confederate surgeons collected, that Polish doctors tested and validated. Today you can buy wild lettuce tinctures online, dried leaves in health food stores, capsules marketed as natural sleep aids. Prices range from $15 to $30 per bottle. But there's a problem. Quality varies wildly. There's no Food and Administration oversight, no standardization, no guarantee that what's labeled wild lettuce actually contains meaningful amounts of lactucarium. The knowledge of how to harvest it properly, how to extract the sap at peak potency, how to dry and preserve it correctly. That wisdom passed away with the last generation of pharmacists who stocked it. What remains are fragments scattered across herbal medicine books, homesteading forums, and the memories of people who refuse to forget. 75 million Americans suffer chronic pain. The pain management industry projects $120 billion by 2033. And a plant requiring no prescription, no refill, no patent, no profit, still waits in ditches where it's always grown. It waits, but not forever. Knowledge has a way of coming back. The Confederate surgeons knew, the Polish doctors knew, the counterculture remembered, and now you know. Wild lettuce never needed approval from an industry built on patents and profit. It just needed people willing to remember, cut the stem, watch the white sap bleed. 2,500 years of knowledge, growing free at the roadside. The pharmaceutical empire didn't bury it. They just convinced us to forget. But some things refuse to stay buried. If this story mattered to you, give it a like and share it with someone who should hear it. Wild lettuce stayed buried for 80 years because nobody talked about it. Don't let that happen again. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.